Welcome, everybody, to Can I Have a Word, the podcast that explores language and the impact it has on our identity and the people that we become. I'm your host, Carl James, and welcome to season 2 of the podcast. I am really excited to be back here again. I'm so humbled by the responses that I got to season 1. People had a lot of great things to say. People had their own comments, their own questions. And I felt like, we were doing some really good work there. And I'm really happy about the response. So thank you all for that. And yeah, we're back for season 2. There are a couple of new things that I want to try. We might have one or two old guests stopping by, but of course, we're going to have new ones as well. So I'm really looking forward to delving into some really interesting, maybe deeper conversations this year. At least that's what I'm hoping. But yeah, lots of good things to come. So with that, we're gonna go ahead and dive in. This is gonna be a solo episode. Shocking, it's just me. And the word that I wanted to choose for this first episode of the season is something that's been on my mind for a while. It's been in the sort of, as they say, zeitgeist in the ether for a while, and it's something that I wanted to explore and unpack. And that word is masculinity. Lots of things come to mind when people think of the word masculinity. It has been talked about. There have been shows about it. If you watched the show Adolescence on Netflix, it delves very much into the experience of young boys what happens to young boys who don't have a fulsome, more expansive emotional palette, and the detrimental impact it can have not just on that individual, but also a family and then a community. Um, it's obviously come up as a result of the current political climate that we're in. I don't need to say more about that, but it is very much a thing. And when I talk about the political climate, I'm specifically referring to voting patterns and voting tendencies and what attracts people to certain candidates. And there has been this idea, without delving too far into the weeds here, but there has been this idea that part of what's happening is that men who feel as though traditional aspects of masculinity are either no longer as palatable as they once were, and therefore they are feeling lost. They are feeling as if they don't have a place, and that is causing some to vote in particular ways or act in particular ways. And there has been this sort of conflict between the evolving understanding of masculinity with a sort of return to a traditional idea of masculinity. And clearly, I have my thoughts. And so that is why I wanted to explore this topic today. So, getting into it, I guess the question that I want you to hold in your mind or to think about as we talk about it is, what do we do with a definition of masculinity that never made space for all of us in the first place? Now, you're probably thinking, what the heck is he talking about? I will go into that further, but what I argue is that the way that we understand masculinity, at least the traditional form, was very much curated and was largely um, devoid of certain identity groups, certain aspects of character, and quite frankly, it's just a very limited definition. But that became the pervasive way that we understood masculinity over time. And what I'm arguing now is that there is this growing, not even growing, this huge tension between, again, the traditional term and what I think is happening today. So that's what I wanted to explore. So if you think about like traditional ideas of masculinity, what comes to mind? Words like strength, assertiveness, independence, maybe even a certain type of stoicism. I would argue, to go even further, that a lot of traditional masculinity really has focused on this idea of dominance and control as being the sort of pervasive attributes. And I think what I would like to argue for is a more expansive definition that allows us to think about things that we traditionally didn't include when we talked about masculinity. So, thinking about softness, care, vulnerability, emotional intelligence, emotional awareness, all of these things that either have been left out or have been ascribed to women only. I think those are the elements that have been missing in the idea of what we think of as masculinity for a very long time. And it's time that we put them in. And, there are going to be people who have their feelings about that. And, I understand, I get it. But I think if you really think about where we are in terms of how men are currently thinking and functioning and feeling in today's world, I think it's easy to see that there clearly needs to be some thought given into how we frame this idea of masculinity. Again, this idea of dominance and emotional restraint and independence and physical strength are not bad traits in and of themselves. They can be good. I think the problem is that they're just very limited. And when you don't allow for the other skills, other attributes like emotional intelligence, like care, like empathy, I think it can lead to a lot of the problems that we see today. And to break that down even further, if you think about the systems and ideologies that have contributed to the way that we understand masculinity today, it's touched everything. So if you think about whiteness, for example, whiteness was largely the model. I mean, you can go back, I don't need to tell you this, go back to a history book if you want to argue that. I can't help you. If you think about the fact that white men, cisgendered, heterosexual white men, were the prototype for everything. They exuded power. They were the standard bearers of logic and reason and leadership. And so everything was positioned from this very narrow lens. And then you tie in capitalism. Capitalism was very much tied to masculinity in terms of labor and income and productivity, being a provider. Men made the money. So your job as a man in society was to take care of your family financially. Then you add, I mentioned the sort of cisgender heterosexual aspect. Heteronormativity is very much a part of this because within the sort of realm of sexuality and gender roles, there's a lot of stigmatizing of queerness, queer identity, and emotionality. And as a member of the LGBT community myself, I can say that this happens even to this day. There's a lot of, I would say, overperformance of what is defined as masculinity, even if you think about roles within gay relationships. There is still somehow in, our current times, this perception of one person being the more masculine one and one person being the more feminine one. And this idea that there has to be this kind of binary within even homosexual relationships is still something that exists. And the idea that if you are more emotional within your relationship, you are deemed less masculine as compared to maybe your partner. And so heteronormativity is very much a part of this too, and we don't really talk about that. And then you add on, the media, you add on religion, community, all of these different systems and ideologies and ways that we interact all come together to contribute to a lot of these stereotypes and norms that many of us buy into, whether we realize it or not. I can easily say that I perform masculinity too, because I think I grew up with this idea of what it meant to be a man. And even though I was a gay man, I was still a man. And I knew that I assumed that there were certain things that I had to do and in certain ways that I had to be a responsible man of society, but it never talked about emotional intelligence. That was never a thing. Never talked about empathy, never talked about taking accountability, apologizing. These are all things that I learned on my own, and most of us do, hopefully. But if you think about how boys are raised, I mean, and it starts, whether it's in sports, which sports are a good thing. I'm not coming for the sports. Please play the sports. But you think about the sort of mentality that goes into, kid sports where you got to toughen up, you got to, be strong, you got to go out there, you got to win. And, those ideas get put into your head at a very early age about what it means to be a young boy growing into a man and, sort of finding your center, your power. And I think what's happened or what happens is that for those who feel like they maybe don't meet that standard of what masculinity is, it starts to create this, call it shame, anger, confusion. And then I think there's a good deal of, emotional suppression that happens. Um, and this impacts not just, again, the individual, but it impacts families and it impacts society at large. The Department of Justice did a study between, I think it was 1966 and 2019, so a huge chunk of time, where they looked at mass shootings in the US. And it's no surprise, maybe it will surprise you, but 98% of mass shootings are committed by men. 98%. That's not something that happens by accident. Yeah, so for all of those reasons, I think we're at a place now where masculinity needs to be redefined and embrace some of those characteristics that I was talking about, whether it's empathy, care, vulnerability. And one person in our current world who I think really exemplifies what it means to be a modern man who exemplifies this type of masculinity is former basketball legend Dwayne Wade. Um, Dwayne Wade had an amazing NBA career. Um, and a few years ago, his daughter came out as transgender. And you can imagine being a black male who is a father, who is an athlete, and has a very public persona, and then having to parent a trans child. That is not an easy terrain to navigate, again, especially as a public figure. But what's been beautiful to watch about someone like Dwayne Wade is that he's fully embraced his role in that way of his trans daughter, just not even just being supportive, but being a true advocate for LGBT youth writ large. He's also experimenting with his own, call it stylistic expression. Like you can see him with his nails painted. If you see him at different events, he's got bold outfits on, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's a beautiful thing to see and watch. And I love that he's allowing for a more expanded idea of what it means to be a man. And there are others. And, we don't have to, I don't want to rattle off a whole list, but he's the one that always comes to mind when I think about like who is really embodying that now. And, you know, there are other things that, oftentimes as a man that you can sometimes get clowned for, whether it's, crying in public. There's nothing wrong with crying in public. Like this idea that you need to like suppress emotion because I don't know why we think we need to do that, but that is another hallmark of this sort of like old idea of being masculine that I think needs to just kind of go away. Um, and letting go of this idea that being a man means that you can't show vulnerability. I think showing vulnerability is one of the most empowering things you can do, and it creates a much wider emotional palette, and it allows for you to deal with all the things that life will throw at you. And I think when you suppress those emotions, like I was talking about, and I'm not saying obviously everyone doesn't turn into someone who then commits some form of violence, but it's no surprise that some of the people that do commit that level of violence have done a great deal of emotional suppression and, don't know how to deal with loss, don't know how to deal with rejection, don't know how to deal with feeling as if they don't have a place somewhere. And so I think if we can get to a place where we start to embrace these other ideals and attributes within masculinity, I think it just opens up more possibilities for what people can be and what men can grow to, ultimately become. So I want you to think about like, what is your personal relationship to masculinity? Whether you are a man yourself, you've got men in your life, whether it's your partner, your father, brothers, people you work with. Um, think about whether you've ever seen someone perform masculinity in order to feel safe, respected, or even loved. Um, and what did it cost? I think for me, I learned, very early on, just based off what I saw around me, that I didn't necessarily want to be the same type of man that exhibited the sort of lack of emotion that I saw. The only real emotion that I saw from a lot of men that were around me when I was young was anger and maybe general complacency, but I never saw, a kind of emotional depth that I wanted to see. And it wasn't until I myself started, I talk about the therapy all the time. Sorry, I'm getting on my soapbox. But um, because I went to therapy starting in college, and I'm clearly not in college anymore, there's been a lot of time that I've spent sort of exploring my own range of emotions and what I've gone through and how I've processed it. And I'll tell you, you know, there are times where sometimes like the things that I'm dealing with are really, really tough and I don't always feel great. Sometimes I feel pretty shitty, if I'm being honest. But the thing that has always allowed me to come out of that is knowing that these are emotions that everyone feels and that it's okay to feel them. And I have tools to actually deal with it and go through it. And so masculinity can still offer things like presence and responsibility and strength and love. It just doesn't have to always include this idea of control and dominance and manipulation of how I feel so that nobody can tell how bad it is. I think one of the things that really bothered me, I mean, obviously, when anyone attempts or completes suicide, it's awful. Um, a few years back, when the dancer and Twitch, who was Ellen's, he was the DJ on Ellen's talk show. He was well known from So You Think You Can Dance, and just a generally lovable guy. Always had a smile on his face. When he completed suicide, it really hit me that you don't know, and this goes for anybody, but you don't really know what people are going through. And oftentimes, I think people put smiles on their face when they're really hurting inside. And I remember thinking, wow, like this guy seemed to have everything, had a beautiful family, had an amazing job. Everybody loved him. He was dancing all over the place, nothing but smiles. And clearly, he was hurting inside. And I don't know if he ever sought help. I don't know. I didn't know him personally, obviously, so I don't know what he was going through, but it was clear that there were things that weren't dealt with. And there are plenty of examples like him. And so I think if we can start to open up this idea of what men can be and allow for more vulnerability publicly, I think it can only better society at large, period. Um, and so, kind of just wrapping it up, I think for this moment and with this season, um, I want to think about masculinity the way that I think about a lot of things and think about it in terms of a language that's evolving. And I think despite all the rhetoric that we are hearing and having to confront in our various political systems and in popular culture and certain podcasts, I'm not going to go there, but you know what I'm saying. I think there is a world where we can start to reclaim some of these ideas about what it means to be masculine and make them inclusive, make them allow for them to be more than just dominance and control. I think there has to be more to it than that. And I think we'll only be, you know, the better for it. So that's it for masculinity. Please share your thoughts, write, let me know what you're thinking. To that point, because we're doing new things and we're growing and expanding, I want to tell you all about my brand new website, which I've launched. It's called carljamesspeaks.com. That's just my name, carljamesspeaks.com. And it's really a place where um, I'm going to share more content. So you'll be able to access the podcast there, audio and video, but I have a blog. So, there's going to be some additional things that I'm going to write about that you can read there. And also, if you are interested in, bringing your boy in for a talk, or whether it's your company, your school, your nonprofit organization, I really want to take the work that we're doing here and the conversations that I'm having out. I mean, it's already out because, it's out here in the world, but, taking it to specific places where we can have more in-depth conversation and really sort of dig into some of these ideas a bit more. And so, yeah, if that's something that you're interested in, please go to the website and send me a message, and we can try to make that happen. And then, of course, you can also find me on all the socials, Instagram, wherever you want. But I'm really excited to be back. So much more that I want to share, and some great guests coming in. So I look forward to seeing you all next time. So with that, I'm going to leave you. And yeah, take care, and I'll see you on the next episode. Bye, everybody.